Okay, welcome Triple SI friends to my kitchen. What you're gonna see here is me completely in my backstage. I've got my White Sox hat on. I got my Bears hoodie on. This is my run through of my George Herbert Mead lecture for the National Communications Association. Um, there's a required registration sort of thing for that. And so we wanted to make this available to our community. So I'm recording my practice run through for everybody. And so I hope being an interactionist, you will appreciate the backstaginess of all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed as if I was presenting this at the meetings. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so first, I hope everybody can see me and hear me. I'm giving this presentation from my kitchen. It's where I have the best Wi-Fi. Hopefully, that'll work out all right. Let me start timing myself here. And I want to thank Serena Chen for inviting me to give this lecture, and Denise Polk for commenting, and for all of you for coming and participating in this. I know everybody has pandemic Zoom fatigue. We've all kind of got the blues, so I thought I'd lighten the mood with a little bit of a joke to get things started. So what do you get when you invite a sociologist to talk at a communications meeting? You get a below average presentation. No, too early, too soon? Anyways, I hope that my disciplinary style won't distract you from the content of this talk, and hopefully the content will be better than that very lame joke. So my title today is Learning to Think Like an Economist Without Becoming One, Professional Education and Ambivalent Reproduction in a Masters of Public Affairs program. And this is based on a 2-year observational and interview study of an MPA program co-authored with Matt Gowerty, who's now at Whitman College. So what you're going to see here are the results of an ethnography of an MPA program. And I thought a fun way to start would be with this New York Times piece from back in March of 2018. What if sociologists had as much influence as economists? And this was all over my Facebook feed. And it's the kind of thing that my colleagues and I obsess about with our economics envy. Quote, walk half a city block in downtown Washington, and there's a good chance that you'll pass an economist. People with advanced training in the field shape policy on subjects as varied as how healthcare is provided, broadcast licenses auctioned, and air pollution regulated. Excuse me. Now, this question, it's not the direct focus of my talk. It's more of a specter that sort of haunts this presentation, but it reflects the dominance of economists in the field of policymaking. And it also recognizes that it could be otherwise. And so it begs the question, why do economists have so much influence on policy? And there are a number of possible answers to this question. And it could be that the economists are just right. As a sociologist, I'm skeptical, but I'll grant that for some things, under perfect conditions, ceteris paribus, as they commonly say, you know, they're right about some things. But I think that the prominence of economics far surpasses its utility. So it's perhaps more likely that economics has been constructed as right. And this has been the result of a successful, lengthy professional project that involves gaining control over jurisdiction, in this case, the arena of policymaking. And it goes hand in hand with the spread of neoliberalism and globalization. So economists have helped to create the conditions for their own success in the policy realm. They've participated in the spread of neoliberalism, and in doing so, they've created a world in which their style of thought seems ever more appropriate and applicable, what's been called the performativity of economics. Another consideration is what's been called the flexible unity of economics. There are many types of economists, and they actually span the political spectrum, but they agree on a core set of concepts and methods, and that could be contrasted to what might be called the flexible fragmentation of sociology. But that kind of unity gives them coherence and strength in the policy realm. Now, another answer is that economists don't actually have as much influence as it may seem. Yes, they have a lot of positional authority and they do hold key positions, but their efforts to direct policies are mediated and they change by local conditions and political considerations. And their influence tends to be indirect, occurring through the discourse that shapes how policymakers understand an issue, and not through specific prescriptions. Now, I think that there's kernels of truth to all of these answers, but I think that they're partial and incomplete. And I think that another part of the answer is that economics, and not just economists, but economics has a prominent position in policy schools and associated degrees. So the Masters of Business Administration, Masters of Public Administration, Masters of Public Affairs, which is going to be our focus today, and the Masters of Public Policy. So this leads to another question, which really is our focus today. How do future policy professionals learn economic rationales? And this is the main question that I want to grapple with here. And this question, how do future policy professionals learn economic rationales? This motivates an ethnographic study of a Masters of Public Affairs program as a site of professional socialization and economic socialization in particular. So I've become increasingly curious about this nexus between policy, the professions, and economics. And to preview the main finding, the students learn to think like an economist without becoming one, in a process of ambivalent reproduction. And this phrase, think like an economist, that comes from our data. And it's also the title of a new book by Beth Berman on the rise of economics in policy circles from the 1960s to the 1990s. So this is both a finding and a play on Beth's excellent new book. And in sum, the students learn to think like an economist, but they remain skeptical. They reject the idea that they are economists, and they remain skeptical even as they're primed to recognize economic rationales and accept them as legitimate in a process that we're calling ambivalent reproduction. And I think that this provides another way to understand why the influence of economics is mediated and indirect. The process of professional socialization, or what Bill Corsaro calls interpretive reproduction, it both builds a constituency for economics, but with incomplete acceptance. So if the question is, how do future policy professionals learn economic rationales? Our answer is through a process of ambivalent reproduction. And that's what I want to show you today. So let me give you a roadmap for what follows. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the conceptual framework, an approach known as inhabited institutionalism. Talk a bit about the research methods, and I'll start to tell the empirical story by giving you some background on the students as well as the MPA program. And then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the empirical story and try to grapple with this so what question as we conclude. All right, so we take an inhabited institutional approach, and inhabited institutionalism draws from new institutionalism in organizational and cultural sociology, as well as symbolic interactionism in social psychology. So this involves viewing economic theory as an institutional myth or logic or rationale, and I'll unpack that in what follows. And it also involves a focus on how people respond to and interpret institutional rationales. So in this view, economics as a prominent institutional rationale, it's not an abstraction. Rather, it's inhabited by people doing things together, whether in concert or in conflict. And these interactions, in this case, between faculty and students and their peers, those interactions shape what economics is and how people act towards it. And from the new institutional side, I use the concept of institutional myths, and I view economic theory as an institutional mythology. So let me explain this. So broadly defined, institutional myths are widespread cultural ideals that provide a rationalized account for how something is supposed to be. For example, in K through 12 education, accountability. Accountability is a widespread ideal for how schools ought to operate in the 21st century. Schools ought to be accountable for their results, and they ought to be a series of rewards and punishments for their performance, usually based on standardized test scores. And I give the example of accountability because it's an institutional myth that I've studied in my own prior research. And these myths, they're mythic in two senses. So they're mythic in the legendary sense of a cultural account, but they're also mythic in the false sense that they may or may not accord with how things actually are. For example, on the ground, from the perspective of actual school needs, accountability policies might be completely irrational. And so teachers and administrators might find ways around them, perhaps by gaming test scores, without really changing what they do, creating a loose coupling with accountability and a flourish of myth and ceremony. Oh, look at our test scores. And now, admittedly, the terminology of myths can be confusing. So scholars use the terminology of institutional rationales or logics along with institutional myths. And in this talk, you'll hear me talk about myths and rationales pretty much coterminously. So with this, I view economic theory as an institutional mythology, and it's mythic in the legendary sense. So economic theory provides an account for how a broad number of things, in this case policy, are supposed to operate, and not simply the economy. And this account is seen as broadly legitimate, to go back to the example of education. Well, of course we should run our schools like a business. And it's also mythic in the potentially false sense. So that economic account, it may or may not accord with how things actually are. And economists themselves, they tacitly recognize this each time they use their frequent disclaimers, such as assuming a rational actor or ceteris paribus, all things being equal. So in sum, I take the position that economic theory is an institutional mythology. Instead of merely eclipsing prior mythologies such as religion or aristocracy or tradition, economics itself has become a contemporary mythology. It's a widespread cultural account for how elements of society ought to work, including elements that are well beyond the scope of classical economic analysis. And this is why we see economic explanations for so many things, like how schools should operate, which are not at base economic. From the symbolic interactionist side, I focus on how people respond to and interpret situations on the ground through their interactions with each other, what Howie Becker refers to as people doing things together. And with this, Herbert Blumer's three premises of symbolic interactionism provide a really useful heuristic. So people act towards things, in this case, economics, based on the meanings those things economics have for them. The meanings of such things, economics, arise from social interactions, in this case, between faculty and students and students and students. And the meaning of such things, economics, are modified through an interpretive process. And I'm also drawing on classic interactionist research on occupational socialization. In fact, the initial inspiration for this project was wanting to redo the classic study, Boys and White Student Culture in Medical School, in the contemporary context of a Master's of Public Affairs program. And this line of work emphasizes how students themselves respond to their professional or occupational training. And I'm also drawing on research on peer culture. And so just as children interpretively reproduce the world around them, and in doing so create their own peer cultures, MPA students also interpretively reproduce economics. And part of this occurs through priming events, where people attend prospectively to an imagined professional future. Okay, so in terms of methods, this is based on a 2-year ethnographic study of a class of MPA students in the School of Public Affairs, or SPA, at Central University. And I should say, these are all pseudonyms. But this is a highly regarded program. It's among the top 10 in the world, and it's accredited by the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration. And it's a good case because the Masters of Public Affairs sits between the Masters of Public Administration and the Masters of Public Policy. So in the program that I studied, there's a saying that once students go through their course of the classes that everyone takes, if they get a concentration in public or nonprofit management, the degree looks a bit more like a MPAD, whereas if they get a concentration in policy analysis, their degree looks more like a Master's of Public Policy. So this is a good case. It allows us to sort of gain leverage for thinking about all 3 degrees. And now it's also important to note that SPA is a hybrid organization. It sits in a complex institutional environment, and it reflects many institutional rationales. And economics is just one, but as we'll see, it's a very prominent one. In the larger project, we take it as a whole and also reflect on civic and community rationales. But for the purposes today, we're going to focus on the economic component. So how do we actually do this? Well, we put together approximately 330 days of field work combined, as well as 21 interviews with faculty and administrators, and 145 interviews with 71 different students. And 33 of these students we were able to interview 3 times in their first semester, their second semester, and their last semester. And 14 students were interviewed 2 times. And we also collected classroom materials and historical documents, as well as a brief demographic survey. In terms of the observations, they were organized by cohorts. So the school put all of the students into 4 initial cohorts. And 2 of those 4 cohorts were based on whether students had an initial interest in policy analysis, and the other 2 were based on whether the students had an initial interest in nonprofit management. And what Matt and I did was we picked one of each of those cohorts, and we went through the core with those cohorts. So this involved observing public management economics. This was essentially a microeconomics class, public finance and budgeting, statistical analysis for effective decision-making. This was a statistics class up through OLS regression, public management class, law and public affairs, as well as a capstone project, which involved working with an external client on a project. And I should say that this core requirements, these reflect NASPA standards. So these are common across these kinds of programs. And fully half of these classes, the starred ones, were either specifically about economics, reflected economic styles of thought, and or were taught by professors who were themselves economists. So we can see the prominence of economics here. And we also observed classes that were broadly popular throughout the program and part of the 2 most popular concentrations, policy analysis and nonprofit management. So we observed cost-benefit analysis, public program evaluation, data analysis and modeling for public affairs. This was an advanced stats class, econometrics, nonprofit management, and fundraising, as well as a number of orientation and professional development seminars. And again, 3 of these classes were either specifically about economics or reflected economic styles of thought and or were taught by economic professors. And these, throughout the program, these were popular electives. So even for the nonprofit management students who didn't have to take these econ-oriented classes, they were very popular. And we also did a number of observations outside of the class. I'm just going to keep moving along here. All right, so let me start by giving you a bit of background on the students. So here's some basic demographic information from our interview sample, which is demographically similar to the overall student body. So as you can see, somewhat more women than men, and this is common for these programs. They also reflect NASPA statistics. And overwhelmingly white, with very little racial diversity, although quite a bit of international representation. However, there was quite a bit of variety in the undergraduate degrees, in terms of the student backgrounds, and not just coming in with social science backgrounds, but also humanities and even the natural sciences. But the common strand was extensive service experience, so things like extensive volunteering, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, and the like. And with this, the students were attracted to the SPA motto, leadership for the public good. So as one student said to me with a self-deprecating smile, she told me they're a bunch of Molly do-gooders. And this is reflected in how the students describe themselves. So as one student explained, I wanted to come to SPA so I could learn specifically how to work with the public sector on issues that I feel like would help people. And another said, I knew I wanted to do something to help people. Now, this is also reflected in how the students describe their classmates. So to quote one student, everyone wants to change the world. It really is a group of people that are like, I want to change the world. I know that people normally shoot that down and laugh, but we're going to find a way to do it and then make fun of ourselves for being those people. Likewise, another said, everyone really wants to do something good. And that's why the most common thread is everyone wants to do something to help something, to make something better, to improve something. They all really want to do good. And the students were not in it for the money. Quote, no one is here because they want to make $1 bajillion. And another said, I think the sentiment underneath the whole thing is that people want to make a difference and they're gravitating towards careers that may not make them as much money as they could because they're all highly capable individuals if they pursued other avenues. So money is not a measure of success for these people, is my sense. As another put it, there's a reason why we are here and not there in the B school, you know. We want to work in the public sector and we want to help people. Now, while the students did not have an economic motivation, economics had a big place in the program. And once they were enrolled, they were immersed in a curriculum that was in fact very similar to a B school. And this similarity to a B school relates to the background of the program. So let me give you a bit of context here. The summer before classes started and before we started our observations, we interviewed the very first dean of the program, and he discussed the founding of SPA. And this dean had come to the program after being an associate dean in the B school at the same university. And he told us, it seemed to me what the field really needed was a professional management program. And that's what I thought this school should be. And we structured it accordingly. So if you look at how we're structured, fundamentally a business school in the public sector in some ways. We never said that, but that's really what we were. And he felt that the students graduating from one of these programs need to understand economics. So we put economic content in the program, be able to do quantitative analysis, statistical analysis. And he said that this entailed hiring economists. If you look at the faculty, they're probably more economists than political scientists. And notice how he constructs the program as professional and ties it to economics. So while the students may not have seen economics as a draw, it was an important part of the program from the very start. And here's some more of that background. And actually, I should probably call this foreground context because it emerged from a student talking about her present. This is from a first semester interview with a student who had done her undergraduate study in a business school. And she told us, the classes I'm taking now at SPA are basically a mirror of the classes I took my senior year in B school, but basically just for the public sector. I took econometrics, which was a lot like the stats course we're taking, and data analysis and things like that. And then managerial economics, which is very similar to our microeconomics class. So there's a real correspondence between what the dean had told us and what this student was expressing and experiencing, even though economics was not the draw for the students. Okay, So what's going on in these econ classes? What's the purpose? As Professor Robertson told us in an interview before our field work began, he said, with the economics, it's sort of a different way of thinking about things. I don't know that. Well, I know that they're not coming out to be economists, and that's not what the point of the class is. But exposing them to that kind of language, that kind of vocabulary and way of thinking, I think is important. So this professor knows that the students will not become economists, but nonetheless feels like it's important that they acquire that way of thinking. And then another professor, Professor Evans, said nearly the same thing. He told us, in my class, the class I teach that I basically taught every semester since I've been here, that public management economics, getting training or teaching them to think differently, to get outside of their comfort level. So early on, when I do my case studies, I'll have people who are writing as if they were writing in their discipline quite often. And I have to keep beating them on the head saying, no, you're an economist in this class. So even though you don't like economics, you don't like the way economists think, you need to think that way. And then Professor Evans carried through with this on the very first day of classes at 8 a.m. Monday morning. He told the students, and remember, in this class, you're an economist. You're not a sociologist, not a political scientist, not an English major. And he says they'll be focusing on economic principles. And it's not that we don't care about that other stuff, we just don't have time. So when they do turn in their case studies and make a policy recommendation, don't tell me how you feel. You can tell the other students how you feel, but I care about the economics. And then he continued his introduction by asking the class, why is economics known as the dismal science? So then he cold calls Olivia, who responds, maybe it's because it's about making rational claims. So then Professor Evans prods her. Is there something wrong with rational claims? So she responds, not if you're doing things in a lab. But Professor Evans walks over to the window and points outside. This is my lab. So then he calls out Monty, who responds with a chuckle. I would call it dismal because I don't like it. So Professor Evans grins. Why not? And Monty responds, it's not organic enough. Then another student responds, is it because it takes emotion out, the inner feeling? But Professor Evans prods them. So you think we're heartless? And says he actually has evidence of my heart. It's an actual picture that he's shown other classes from one of his doctor's appointments. So Professor Evans then points to the PowerPoint saying it has to do with these two things, and he's pointing to scarcity and choice. So then a student asks, is it dismal because you have to make difficult choices about scarcity? And Professor Evans responds, that's right. I have to make a choice. And he refers to the Rolling Stones and starts to sing, you can't always get what you want. Instead, choices aren't always fun. And continuing, he says that the market is important for anything they do and the rational consumer. He says there's a burgeoning work on the irrational consumer, but it hasn't made its way into mainstream economics yet. So we pretend people are rational. And throughout the rest of the semester, in the days that followed, he built on these basic tenets. So the market and the rational consumer, with the market and the rational consumer leading to an understanding of price and quantity and supply and demand. Utility maximization in terms of minimizing costs and maximizing benefits. Efficiency and how all of this entails quantitative models. All in the service of, quote, just trying to get you to think like an economist, often with an acknowledgement of ceteris paribus, all things being equal. Now, not surprisingly, given the flexible unity of economics, we saw these same things in the other classes that we observed. And here's just two quick examples. So Professor Wright tells the students that economists assume people maximize utility and enter into exchange if it's good for them. The assumption is that allowing people to do stuff will make things better. Professor Wright goes over two key assumptions associated with game theory. Decision makers are rational, which means they act in their own self-interest to maximize their benefits. And this economic style of thought was drilled into the students via quizzes and tests and assignments. For example, later that semester, Professor Evans turned the students' graded case studies about the Department of Transportation and airport landing slots. All right, so what was I looking for here? He says that if they had discussed it in class, he would have had to have listened to God. All those small communities, they're going to lose their service. But if the market works, so be it. Then he continues. So basically, I wasn't real sympathetic to people saying, we got to keep service going. And I know you have big hearts, but you have to think like an economist. We care, but you think about efficiency first in order to expand the pie. So he prods them. So what's their recommendation? And Olivia responds, maybe it's not efficient to have small planes flying into LaGuardia. It might make sense to have larger planes flying into larger airports. And the students get it. They get that thinking like an economist involves scarcity, choice, the market, rational actors, utility maximization, efficiency, quantitative models, ceteris paribus, and so on. And they could also employ this style of thought in their broader lives as students. For example, in an interview with Pete, where he was telling me about his other coursework, he told me, in public management, we're supposed to read a lot of different articles every week, which wouldn't be that big of a commitment to me, but I always think in terms of economics now, but based on the marginal utility I gain out of reading an extra thing for public management, it's just not beneficial in the calculus of things to me. And this style of thought was prominent throughout the program. For example, in her fourth semester, on the way out, in reflecting on her 2 years at SPA, Maya told me, I think as you go on, everything gets more quantitative, which I didn't anticipate after my first semester, because in my first semester, I took an economics class and a statistics class, and I was like, okay, got that out of the way, which is totally false. It's like I thought I was going to have to take one statistics class and one economics class. And I've really taken 3 economics classes. And she was referencing the core microeconomics class, as well as cost benefit analysis and public program evaluation, as well as the required statistics class. Now, interestingly, Maya was getting a concentration in nonprofit management. So some of those additional classes weren't required for her degree program. But they were strongly encouraged, and she thought it was important to take these electives, even though it wasn't what she anticipated. So the students can think like economists, but they don't buy it hook, line, and sinker. And as just one example, in the middle of the first semester, Professor Wright goes over the midterm course evaluation. I'll read the last comment on what someone liked least. The subject matter economics, yuck. He continues, I believe you are traveling a well-trod path traveled by many students over the years with that same sentiment. The best I can say is that economics is not for everybody. It's a different way of thinking. That is a reasonable sentiment. And the students struggled with the seeming importance of economics in the program and their dislike for it. For example, as Colleen reflected on her classes, she said, my least favorite is econ. I don't know if it's going to be least useful. Again, I don't know how I'm really going to apply it, but I don't think that SPA would have us take a class that's not going to be useful to us, especially a core class. It's just not my favorite just because I don't think in the way that economists have to think in. But that said, Professor Wright is great. And here are some more examples of that struggle. I think econ has the potential to be really relevant, and I was hoping it would be taught more from a public affairs perspective. But it's just econ, you know? And so I've learned that stuff in my undergrad, and it's not necessarily something that fascinates me, unless there was a bit of understanding of the public affairs side of it. So it sounded really nice. Another student, I don't know, I'm not sure how the economic concepts are ever going to help me, to be honest. Like, I know that marginal revenue should equal marginal cost, but other than that, it's hard to grasp what I'm going to get out of the class. And as another said, econ is so annoying. Ceteris paribus annoys me so much, because when in life are all things equal? And this issue, this struggle, it wasn't just during that first semester. So a full year later, I asked Adria, when SPA MPAs graduate and leave CU, what do you think they leave with? And she said, that's the ultimate question. And a lot of my friends have discussed we're the product, and I'm not sure what we are or what we're capable of doing. I think we're much more versed in the language of certain economic arguments. We've got the basic language skill set. I wouldn't say there's a lot of depth. We can communicate with this economist or that statistician, but no one SPA is going to be, I don't think, capable of doing the deep kind of work in those fields. So Adria is saying that they can think like an economist in some sort of basic way, but they aren't capable of becoming one, even if they wanted to, which they don't. So as another student said, if she wanted to be an economist, she would have gone into a PhD program. Okay, so what are we to make of this? What's going on in these classes? And not just the core economics class, but also the public finance class, we see this, the budgeting class, cost benefit analysis, public program evaluation, and even in the statistics classes, all of which were taught by economists and have that kind of institutional rationale. So I think this quote is really hits on some important things, and it captures a lot. I won't read it again, but the classes are priming events. They're activities in which people, by their participation, attend prospectively to anticipated changes in their lives. So the students know that this is supposed to relate to their future careers, and that as professionals, part of their work will involve thinking like an economist, but not deeply. And it's a process of interpretive reproduction. By participating in the classes, the students appropriate economics, but reproduce it in their own unique ways with ambivalence and cynicism, a process that we're calling ambivalent reproduction. But so what? Still, what are we to make of all this? To summarize, we started with the background question of why do economists have so much influence on policy? And to think about this question, I introduced the concept of institutional myths and economic theory as an institutional mythology. So economics, instead of merely eclipsing prior mythologies, such as religion or aristocracy or tradition, economics itself has become a contemporary mythology. It's a widespread cultural account for how multiple elements of society should work, and not simply the economy. So economic theory is no longer constrained to a narrow milieu. And as a contemporary mythology for how society operates, economics is structured into professional education. So in the MBA, the MPAD, the MPA, and the MPP, it's an institutional mythology. And correspondingly, our main question became, how do future policy professionals learn economic rationales? And the answer has been through a process of ambivalent reproduction, learning to think like an economist without becoming one. And this helps us to understand the authority of economics, but its indirect mediated influence. So ambivalent reproduction further reinforces the legitimacy of economics by spreading its cognitive infrastructure and incorporating novices into an epistemic community with a distinct style of thought. But at the same time, it diminishes enthusiasm and the perceived relevance of the approach. So this result is contradictory, much as we would expect with ambivalence. Economics is seen as worthwhile and legitimate, but not particularly relevant. And here it's a mythology in that second sense, in that potentially false sense. So this question, how do future policy professionals learn economic rationales, that had motivated an ethnographic study of a Master's of Public Affairs program as a site of professional socialization and economic socialization in particular, and this nexus between policy professions and economics. And the answer to the question of how do future policy professionals learn economic rationales has been by learning to think like an economist without becoming one. And this process builds a constituency for economics, but with incomplete acceptance. And it helps us to understand the authority of economics, but its indirect mediated influence. So with every graduating class, there's a growing cadre of new professionals who are primed at some level to accept the legitimacy of economics, even as they question its relevance. And this process of ambivalent reproduction helps us to understand the dual aspects of economics as an institutional mythology. On the one hand, as a widely accepted cultural account, but on the other hand, as potentially false in the potentially false sense of the myth. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you and look forward to your questions.